Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to class. Today we are going to focus on reviewing some of the key mechanisms that we talked about in Applied Nutrition in Diet 200. We're going to revisit some of those metabolic processes that you guys learn because we know that sometimes whenever you leave a class, you forget or don't keep those learned topics with you. And it's very important that you guys have a good foundation of those concepts from Diet 200 to carry into Diet 411 because we're going to get a little bit deeper into those metabolic processes, especially how we metabolize macronutrients for energy. So you'll notice in our textbook that the chapters are divided between carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins specifically. So we're going to get very deep into how each of those macronutrients is metabolized for energy. So today what we're going to do is kind of rehash those concepts that you guys learned in Diet 200. We're going to revisit some of those ideas and see kind of where we're going to go with that this semester. So by the end of this lesson, you all should be able to describe those key mechanisms of energy production within all of the cells within the human body. You'll be able to identify those hormones that are involved with metabolism and discuss how each of those hormones plays a role in sort of directing which way some of these metabolic processes can go. Then you're going to apply critical thinking and collaborative skills to complete a group assignment, actually a couple of group activities, and you'll also demonstrate effective professional oral and written communication skills through those group activities as well. So a little rundown of what we're going to be doing today. We're going to start with a short think, pair, share activity, which we'll talk about next. But this is going to help us to sort of revisit some of those ideas from Diet 200, see where we're at, kind of assess our foundational knowledge, and that will help me to understand how deep we need to go and how much we need to review whenever we get back to those carbohydrate and protein and lipid chapters. Following that activity, we're going to do a short presentation via PowerPoint, where I will sort of review some of those concepts, and I invite you all to ask any questions for clarification, or if something jogs your memory and you want to present that idea, I definitely welcome that. And following the PowerPoint presentation, we'll do a group activity where you guys will use one of the worksheets that I sent to you on Moodle before class that will help you to dive a little bit deeper into a specific metabolic process. Y'all will work together to complete that activity, and then we'll share as a class following that. So first, let's just get started with, I want each of you to think about how do our cells make energy from the food that we eat. So generally, we know that food is calories, right? And calories help our body to run. But food is actually energy. Those calories are energy that our cells need to perform functions, right? So I've passed out to each of you a blank index card, and what I want you to do is for 3 minutes, just think about how do our cells make energy from the food we eat? What does that question mean to you? What comes to mind? Anything that you can think of, write it down on your index card, leave your name off of the index card, and for the next couple of minutes, I'm gonna give you some time to fill out your index card. And after that, you will pass your card around. You'll swap cards with a minimum of 6 people. And whenever you swap your card, I want you to make sure that you're swapping cards with someone who is not directly next to you. So that means you got to get up out of your seat, you got to walk around the room, and you got to pass your card. So 6 times, you'll do that, and I'll direct you for whenever we're ready to do that. Okay, so you've had a few moments to think, so make sure that you are finalizing your individual note card, and now I want everybody to get up out of their desk, walk around, share your card with 6 different people. If you happen to grab your card at the end of it all, don't say anything, don't identify your card, don't identify your neighbor's card, all confidential here. Okay, and if you have traded your card 6 times, I want you to find 4 or 5 people and sit down with those people as a group, and I want you all to discuss what is written on the cards that you now hold. So, how do our cells make energy from the food we eat? What did your neighbors think? How does this compare to what you wrote? Have some dialogue with your group to talk a little bit more in depth about how our cells make energy from the food that we eat. So hopefully what some of these cards illustrate is that there's actually several different ways that our cells can make energy from the food that we eat. It's absolutely necessary that we provide ourselves with proper nourishment with those calories to provide energy to those cells. So our food doesn't just automatically present our body with energy. Our cells actually have to do something with it. Those are some of the things that you guys talked about in Diet 200 and how our body actually breaks down those molecules to create energy. So one thing that I want you to always think about is when we're talking about metabolism, we're separated from digestion and absorption. So we eat food, we digest it, okay, we break it down into smaller particles that we can eventually absorb. And once we absorb that, it's not like just fair energy. Our cells still have to take that up and create energy from it. So we have to clearly distinguish between metabolism and the digestion and absorption that happens before. So I think sometimes we can get confused with these concepts because we're thinking at such a small cellular level. But anytime you kind of get in your head or stuck in the mud with that, I want you to try to make that connection in your head to say this is separate from digestion and absorption. We're talking about metabolism. We're talking about creating energy from the tiniest little molecules in our cells. So what is energy, right? This is something that you have talked about probably in multiple classes beyond your dietetics classes. So energy is ATP. That is the primary energy currency in our bodies, in human cells. What ATP is an ADP with an extra phosphate attached, okay? So we have to create ATP from the energy from the food that we consume, all right? And why is that important? ATP is used as energy for every function in the human body, every function that goes on in cells. Okay, so here we're talking about membrane transport. So what can move in and out of a cell? That takes energy. Building or synthesis of new molecules. That takes energy. Okay, so think about building proteins. Think about building triglycerides. Anything that our body needs to function that we have to create within the body, our cells need energy for that. And then finally, mechanical work. For us to be able to breathe, to move muscles, to exercise. Our cells need energy to provide to those tissues, to those organs, to be able to do that work. So clearly, energy is very important to the human body and to every single cell. So when we talk about metabolism, we sort of have two distinct sides. So we have anabolism and we have catabolism. So I normally would ask you at this point, if I wasn't recording a lecture, what is anabolism and what is catabolism? What's the difference? If you ever get confused, think of anabolic steroids, okay? So anabolic steroids are used to bulk up, to build muscles, right? So always think of anabolism as building or synthesis, okay? Whereas catabolism, we're breaking something down, okay? So with anabolism, we're taking things, we're building energy. In catabolism, we're breaking down molecules to relinquish energy, okay? So this diagram here shows you some examples. Anabolism is written in green, whereas catabolic pathways are written in red. Okay, so glycolysis, you see here, we're taking glucose to create pyruvate, and eventually that's going to go into the Krebs cycle or the TCA cycle. Whereas we can take acetyl-CoA that's left over from this to build fatty acids, to build lipids, right? And that's written in green because that's an anabolic process. So I really like this diagram because it shows us how each of these metabolic pathways that surely you have learned about before is truly connected and kind of dependent on each other, okay? So I think this is another difficult concept for students to kind of grasp because we like to kind of put everything in its own little cubby, right? We like to put glycolysis in its own spot, and then we like to put the Krebs cycle here, and then we like to put beta oxidation here, and then the electron transport chain here. But really, they're all so connected. And this is something that we're going to discuss more in depth each chapter whenever we hit every single macronutrient. But think a little bit deeper on that. Why are each of these metabolic processes or pathways so connected? And a lot of that has to do with the fact that our energy production within our cells has to be able to adapt, right? Metabolism has to be able to adapt. And that is because, we could be going through periods of fasting or starvation or exercise, pregnancy or lactation or other different stages of life where our energy needs or our metabolic demand is far greater or far less, okay? We also could be experiencing times of nutrient deficiencies, deficiencies of specific enzymes or hormones that help to drive some of these metabolic pathways. All of this plays into how those pathways work, in which direction they're moving in that anabolic or catabolic pathway. And a lot of that also has to do with our body's constant need for energy, right? However, we don't eat 24/7. We're not always eating and eating and eating. So our body, our cells have to have a means of storage and a means of utilization, okay? So we don't just use up all of the energy that's available at that time. No, our cells are far more sophisticated than just using everything at once or not using everything that we can use. So storage becomes very useful in that aspect. So we are able to store excess energy, maybe in the in carbohydrate energy as glycogen, or we can store extra energy in the form of lipids and triglycerides within our adipose tissue. So our body has a means to create these energy reserves for whenever maybe we're in times of fasting or starvation, or our metabolic demand is greater because we're sick or have experienced trauma. So we have to have sort of multiple pathways to be able to provide energy to our cells no matter what the issue is. Okay? And on top of that, our hormones are sort of in the driver's seat to tell which pathways are going to be utilized at that time. Sort of, are we going in that anabolic direction, or are we going in that catabolic direction? Okay? Specifically, insulin and glucagon. So you've probably heard of insulin and glucagon several times. So I want you to just kind of like think right now, what do you know about insulin and what do you know about glucagon? Okay? Probably you know that insulin helps to lower our blood sugar, whereas glucagon helps to increase our blood glucose, okay? So really, what is happening at that time is a change in the direction of a metabolic pathway, okay? We'll get more into that whenever we get to our carbohydrate metabolism chapter. But I want you to start kind of critically thinking about these things, because it's not just insulin is lowering blood sugar. Insulin is allowing glucose into cells. So it's moving from the blood into the cell where it can actually be utilized for energy. Okay. All right. So another sort of way that each of these metabolic pathways is connected is many of them are metabolized into a common product, and that is acetyl-CoA. So I'll show you here. You'll see that in glycolysis we make pyruvate. Eventually pyruvate is going to be converted into acetyl-CoA, and that can go into the Krebs cycle. Okay. Acetyl-CoA can also go into helping to build fatty acids, and fatty acids can also be broken down into acetyl-CoA and then converted into acetyl-CoA, which again can be put into the Krebs cycle. So we have acetyl-CoA that is kind of behind the scenes directing some of this energy flow, you could kind of call it. So acetyl-CoA is an important molecule that we'll talk about in every single chapter, whether it's carbohydrates, proteins, or lipids metabolism. And another one of those is NADH and FADH. Okay, so NADH and FADH are primarily going to be talked about within the electron transport chain. However, we're going to make NADH and FADH and other parts of the energy pathways as well, especially the Krebs cycle. But these are going to really be utilized within the electron transport chain, and that's important because the electron transport chain is really what is supplying or generating most of the ATP within our cells. Okay, so moving on, these are the 4 main pathways that we're just going to overview today. Again, we're going to get much deeper into these with each of the chapters that we discuss later in this course. But each, you have the printout of the major metabolic pathways diagram that I have in here. So while we go through that, I would like for you to look at this pathway and just kind of see how they're relating. I'm going to walk you through that. So with glycolysis, we are breaking down glucose, okay? You could see this as kind of the first step of the Krebs cycle. That's typically how you're going to see that in a diagram. However, with this diagram, you can see how glycolysis is playing into many other pathways. So the goal of glycolysis is to take glucose and create pyruvate. Okay, so this is happening outside of the mitochondria, just in the cytosol. Okay, so before we get into the mitochondria, we're going to create pyruvate that'll eventually become or be converted into acetyl-CoA and into citrate. Okay, so while the main goal of glycolysis is to break down glucose into pyruvate, we're also making ATP itself and NADH, okay, that can be utilized elsewhere as well. Okay, and with the Krebs cycle, we have to have that acetyl-CoA coming from either fatty acids or from glycolysis itself. Okay, so once we are in the mitochondria, that's where the Krebs cycle can occur. So the big distinguishable characteristic about the Krebs cycle or the TCA cycle is that this is a cyclic operation. Okay, so if we don't have enough of this input here, the TCA cycle cannot continue. Okay. And again, whenever we get into our carbohydrate chapter, we're going to talk more about what it is that's really keeping the TCA cycle going and what happens if that input is not in sufficient supply. Okay, then we have the electron transport chain, and you may remember that this is sort of stitched into that inner mitochondrial membrane. So you see that here. So what the electron transport chain is think of it as taking all of these small, like NADH and FADHs, and creating just the bulk of ATP for ourselves through something that's called oxidative phosphorylation. Okay. And then finally, we have fatty acid oxidation. Oops. We have fatty acid oxidation. So at this state, we're going to be cleaving these carbons and oxygens off of these long fatty acid chains and breaking these down into acetyl-CoA so that we can put that into the Krebs cycle to create energy. So this is just a very brief overview, and the group activity that you're going to do next is you are going to take a little bit deeper of a dive with each of these for your group. But really what I want you to just see is how sort of all of these are connected. And I want you to be able to understand and visualize that connection, because that's going to help you to understand how our hormones are driving which way these pathways are moving, which metabolic processes our cells are going to be sort of taking advantage of mostly at a single time. Okay, so next what you're going to do is you're going to grab your energy metabolism worksheet, and you're going to get into a group of 4 to 5. Try to get into a group of students who you weren't working with earlier in the Think, Pair, Share activity. But you'll also need a Post-it poster, a Sharpie for your group, any notes that you've taken in your textbook. And what you're going to do is I'm going to assign you to one of the metabolic processes that is listed on that activity. I'll pull this up right now. Oops. Here. Okay. So I will tell you if you're going to have glycolysis or the Krebs cycle, beta oxidation, or the electron transport chain. And first what your group is going to do is discuss what is energy metabolism and why we have different routes for that. So I kind of touched on those things, so I want you guys to kind of think about that and how it applies to the specific metabolic process that you are assigned to. Then I want you as a group on your Post-it poster to draw a diagram that illustrates that metabolic process, okay? I want you to be able to describe the basics of what's happening in your metabolic pathway. I want you to know where it's primarily occurring, what is needed, what's broken down, and how it might connect to other metabolic pathways. So I'm going to give you guys 15 minutes to collaborate, think about some of those answers, write on your Post-it paper, and then after those 15 minutes, we're going to present those to the class. So I'll be walking around. If you have any questions, please just raise your hand. I'll be there to kind of guide you and give you feedback. But I'll go ahead and start the timer for 15 minutes now, and please let me know if you have any questions. All right, you guys did a great job with that activity. So why don't you share with me some of the things that you liked about this activity? Did you like that you were doing something a little bit more hands-on, where you had to draw the diagram and then explain it to each other? Did you feel like you guys have a good foundation from Diet 200? What are some things that you think we need to cover a little bit more to make you more comfortable before we move on into the carbohydrate and protein and lipid chapters? So those are some things I would like to know. So feel free to give me that feedback. Next class, we're going to be talking a little bit more about how those hormones drive the way we go in these metabolic pathways. So I have also sent you this blood glucose and hormones worksheet. So this is a little bit more specific to the carbohydrate chapter, which we'll be reviewing next. So take a look at this, and we will work on this together next class as well.